Have you ever seen a news story, maybe about something seemingly small, like a local issue or some, I don't know, unusual behavior that just suddenly blows up?
Uh-huh.
Like it's everywhere, dominating headlines, everyone's worried. How does that tiny spark become this wildfire?
That's a perfect way to put it, and it leads us right into what we're exploring today, the deviancy amplification spiral. It's an idea from sociology. Leslie Wilkins came up with it back in the 60s.
Okay.
And the core idea really is that sometimes the way society reacts to certain behaviors can maybe unintentionally just make those behaviors worse, amplify them.
Right, okay. So the mission for this deep dive then is to kind of unpack how trying to fix what we see as a problem might actually, well, backfire.
Exactly.
How these maybe initially small things can spiral into much bigger issues just because of our response.
Precisely. We want to get a handle on this mechanism, see how it actually plays out in the real world, give you, the listener, a sort of new lens for looking at social issues and, those really dramatic news cycles.
All right, let's dive into the mechanics then. What are the basic steps in this? Deviancy amplification spiral. How does the cycle actually, get going?
Well, it's like a sequence, right? A series of stages that connect and then sort of reinforce each other. It usually kicks off with some initial act of deviance.
Deviance, meaning what exactly?
Yeah.
Like criminal behavior.
Not necessarily. It could be, but it could also just be something relatively minor or just unconventional, something outside the expected norm. The first little step away from the usual pattern.
Okay, so a slight detour from business as usual.
Exactly. Then often the media steps in, and this can be a really crucial turning point.
Ah, the media spotlight.
Right. They can shine a very bright and sometimes distorted light on that initial act. They might focus on the most sensational bits, the unusual aspects, and how they frame it right at the start. That immediately shapes how people see it.
Yeah, we've all seen that happen, haven't we? A small event gets totally blown out of proportion, angled dramatically.
Absolutely. And this amplified picture, it tends to stir up public concern, sometimes even real fear. People get worried, maybe way more worried than the actual initial issue warranted.
Okay.
And that public anxiety, it often puts pressure on, politicians, police, the authorities to intervene.
Which then leads pretty naturally to some kind of official reaction.
Exactly. The response often means more policing, maybe stricter rules targeting the specific people or groups involved. Now, here's where the dynamic really shifts.
Okay.
These stronger reactions, the crackdowns, they can end up alienating the very group that was involved in the first place. They might feel like they're being unfairly targeted, pushed to the edges.
And feeling alienated like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like it could definitely backfire.
It often does, unfortunately. This feeling of being singled out, ostracized, it can sometimes lead to more nonconformist behavior. If people feel they're being labeled negatively, treated badly, they might regrettably start to almost live up to that label.
So they act out more, in line with what everyone expects them to do, which then...
confirms the public's initial worries. It reinforces the whole story that these individuals or groups are a big problem, and that's when the cycle really grabs hold. Each stage just feeds the next, making the original thing seem much, much bigger and more serious than perhaps it was at the start.
That makes a lot of sense as a theoretical model.
Yeah.
But can we pin it down? Is there a real-world example that shows this in action?
Oh, absolutely. A classic historical example, one that really helped Wilkins develop the theory, actually, was the whole thing with the mods and rockers in 1960s Britain.
Mods and rockers. Okay, that sounds like something out of a retro movie. What exactly happened there?
Well, they were these two distinct youth subcultures. You had the mods known for their sharp suits, scooters, that sort of thing.
Right.
And then the rockers more into leather jackets, motorbikes, classic rock and roll. In the early 60s, there were some, relatively minor clashes between these groups, usually at seaside resorts, places where young people gathered. Think maybe some youthful rivalry spilling over, minor fights.
Okay, so some teenage scuffles down by the sea. Doesn't sound like a, national emergency.
Exactly. But the media at the time, they jumped all over these incidents, headlines screaming things like, "Young savages invade seaside towns."
Wow, young savages. That's intense.
Totally sensationalized, painting this picture of widespread chaos and violence. And the key thing here is how that media shift from reporting small incidents to this young savages narrative that immediately cranked up the public concern. That's that crucial second step in the spiral, kicking in hard.
So the media essentially took these little squabbles and turned them into this huge, frightening public spectacle.
You got it. And that, in turn, sparked a kind of public panic. People got genuinely worried, started demanding that the authorities step in, restore order.
So the police got involved more heavily.
They did. And the police response often involved specifically targeting kids who looked like mods or rockers.
Ah, so profiling based on style. If you had a certain haircut or wore particular clothes, you were suddenly suspect.
Pretty much. And you can imagine how those young people felt, right? Being hassled, stereotyped just because of how they looked. It naturally just ramped up the tension, the bad feeling between mods and rockers themselves, actually, but also definitely between them and the police.
Yeah, I can see that breeding resentment.
And that resentment, unfortunately, it fed into more clashes, sometimes bigger ones, which the media then covered even more intensely, further cementing this image of these groups as dangerous troublemakers.
So the initial relatively minor beach fights, because of the reaction they triggered, just escalated and escalated into something much worse. The effort to control it actually made it bigger.
That is the deviancy amplification spiral right there, in action. The reaction amplified the original deviance. So maybe let's quickly revisit those stages we talked about and see how they line up with the mods and rockers.
Good idea. Let's trace it. So stage 1, initial deviance, those minor seaside scuffles.
Exactly. Then step 2, media sensationalism, those over-the-top headlines, young savages, painting a really dramatic picture.
Right. Which led straight to step 3, moral panic, the public outcry, the fear about these youth groups running wild.
And the authorities reacted. Step 4, law enforcement and policy reaction increased policing, targeting kids based on their appearance, which, as we saw, fueled step 5, increased deviance, more frequent, maybe more intense clashes, partly driven by that alienation and resentment.
And then, step 6, the cycle repeats. Every new incident just confirmed the negative stereotypes and led to stronger reactions.
Bingo! It's a feedback loop. The reaction itself makes the behavior it's aimed at worse. So what are the kind of broader takeaways here? Why should you, listening now, care about this spiral concept?
Yeah, what are the implications?
Well, understanding it is pretty important because it shows how sometimes our overreactions can actually be counterproductive. Instead of fixing something, we can unintentionally make it worse.
Right.
We also see how these negative reactions from society can sometimes, ironically, strengthen the identity of the group being labeled as deviant. If you're constantly pushed out, you might find more solidarity within your group, defining yourselves against the mainstream.
It's like if everyone calls you an outsider, eventually you might just embrace being an outsider.
Precisely. And often, the level of public fear whipped up in these spirals can be way out of proportion to the actual threat from the initial behavior. And critically, like the mods and rockers really showed us, the media often plays this huge central role in kicking off the spiral and keeping it going.
It definitely sounds like a potential recipe for making big problems out of smaller ones. Can we look at something maybe a bit more recent to see how this plays out today?
Sure, absolutely. Let's consider the issue of youth knife crime in the UK, specifically around, say, 2007 to 2010.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely more recent and a sensitive topic, too. What was the situation initially?
Well, in certain urban areas, particularly in London, there was a noticeable rise in knife-related incidents involving young people. Now, it's important to stress the initial numbers, while obviously tragic whenever they happen, were statistically relatively low compared to overall crime rates.
But still very concerning, especially involving kids.
Exactly. What made these incidents so potent was their visibility, their emotional impact, especially when school-aged children were involved. That understandably grabs attention and stirs up a lot of fear.
Yeah, you can see how that would happen.
And this is where you really see the deviancy amplification spiral start to turn. The UK tabloid press, TV news, they gave these incidents massive coverage. Headlines like, Britain's knife crime epidemic, or blades on Britain's streets became really common.
Right, crisis language.
Totally. And the media often used quite graphic imagery, sometimes pictures of teens with knives, even if those pictures weren't directly related to this specific event being reported. The perception that grew out of this was that huge numbers of urban teens were just routinely armed and dangerous. That intense media focus quickly set this narrative of a widespread crisis.
So, similar pattern to the mods and rockers. The media paints this really stark, dramatic picture.
Exactly, and that led directly to a significant moral panic. Politicians, public figures made very strong statements. There was huge public pressure on the government, on the police to do something drastic, protect our children. Schools were holding emergency meetings. Parents were understandably deeply worried.
So how did the authorities respond to that pressure? What was the law enforcement reaction?
Well, police were directed to ramp up the use of stop and search power, specifically targeting young people. This often happened in particular neighborhoods, often around schools, areas that frequently had higher proportions of working class or minority ethnic residents.
Wow.
So consequently, a lot of young people, especially from those backgrounds, reported feeling constantly harassed, unfairly targeted. You'd hear stories of kids being stopped and searched multiple times a day, even if they were just, going about their business.
Wow. I can absolutely see how that kind of constant scrutiny would just breed resentment, make you feel singled out and unfairly treated.
Exactly. Teenagers started feeling like they were being criminalized just for wearing a hoodie or hanging out with friends in a group. And here's the really tragic twist.
Yeah.
Some young people who hadn't previously been involved in anything like knife crime actually started carrying knives.
Seriously? Why?
Well, for different reasons, it seems. Some felt they needed it for protection, like the environment was so hostile and fearful they needed to defend themselves. Others maybe did it out of sheer anger and frustration at being constantly labeled and targeted.
Yeah.
They started to sort of internalize that dangerous label society was sticking on them.
That's incredibly sobering. The idea that the reaction itself could push people toward the very behavior everyone was trying to stop.
That's the absolute core of the spiral. Knife carrying, which might have been relatively limited initially, started to become more normalized within certain peer groups, partly as a response to this feeling of being under siege, unjustly targeted.
And then, presumably.
And then, of course, when the knife crime incidents did unfortunately increase in some areas, the media often pointed to that rise as proof. Proof that their initial alarmist reporting was right all along, which just fueled the cycle further.
Wow.
So each new tragic event led to more media amplification, more fear, calls for even tougher policing, more stop and searches, deepening that sense of alienation among many young people, just reinforcing the spiral again and again.
Okay, so let's connect the specific dots here for the knife crime case.
Yeah.
How did that situation really map onto the deviancy amplification spiral model?
Well, you clearly had the media amplification, the sensational headlines, the fear-based reporting that directly created the public overreaction, the moral panic about this supposed epidemic of youth knife crime.
Right.
Then came the harsh policing response, the really aggressive stop and search tactics, increased surveillance, which disproportionately hit minority youth.
Mm-hmm.
That, in turn, led to increased alienation. Young people feeling targeted, stereotyped, pushed away. And tragically, you saw an escalation of the behavior knife becoming more prevalent within certain groups, partly as a reaction to everything else.
So the really crucial insight in this case study is what? That something that started as a genuine, concerning, but maybe more localized issue got massively amplified.
Exactly. Amplified by the media narrative and the way institutions responded. And that overreaction, somewhat ironically, likely played a part in actually spreading the very behavior they were trying to stamp out.
It really underscores how sometimes even well-intentioned responses can have these significant, unintended negative consequences.
Precisely. It's a powerful illustration of that.
This has definitely given us a powerful new way to look at how these things can unfold. So just to recap for everyone listening, we've dug into the deviancy amplification spiral. How an initial act, maybe minor, gets blown up by media and public reaction, leading to alienation, harsher responses, and potentially, paradoxically, more of the behavior that started it all.
And we've seen how central the media often is and how public fear can sometimes get disconnected from the actual scale of the initial problem.
Right. So understanding this framework, it really gives you, the listener, a valuable tool, doesn't it, for looking critically at news reports, at public debates about social issues.
Yeah, it encourages you to maybe pause and think about the potential unintended side effects of how we, as a society, react to things we see as deviant or problematic. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a bit of an aha moment, new perspective.
Absolutely. It's a really potent reminder that how we respond to a problem can be just as important, maybe even more influential than the problem itself. And on that note, here's maybe a final thought for you to chew on.
Okay.
Thinking about things happening right now, current events. Can you spot any situations where maybe, just maybe, a deviancy amplification spiral could be starting to spin up? And thinking about that, how might a more measured, less reactive approach perhaps lead to better, more positive outcomes?
Yeah.
It's definitely worth considering all the different perspectives, isn't it? And maybe questioning some of our own gut reactions about what's really going on.
Yeah.